Hey guys, what you're about to hear might feel unsettling, but it's crucial that it's brought to light. We're pulling back the curtain on a part of history that most textbooks avoid. Not because it's unknown, but because it's uncomfortably close. What we'll uncover isn't just about fallen rulers, it's about how entire civilizations were taught to celebrate their fall. We often imagine that cultures collapse from the bottom up. But history tells another tale. Corruption flows from the top downward like poison in a well. And when those at the top abandon virtue, the people below don't just suffer. They adapt. This isn't a story of isolated wickedness. It's a pattern buried in the archives, repeating with frightening precision. Tonight, we examine how elites, ancient and modern, use their influence not just to indulge, but to reshape the moral spine of their societies. And how that reshaping still echoes in the culture we call normal. So if you've ever felt like something in our world is upside down, you're not alone. If you value history told without blinders and truth spoken without apology, tap the like button and subscribe. Your support helps carry this message past the noise. And now, close your eyes to the glamour. Open them to the pattern. Because what begins in gold-trimmed palaces, so often ends in ruins. Let's begin. What happens when a man who claims to be a god loses all sense of manhood? What happens when an empire applauds his madness instead of stopping it? This is not just the story of Caligula, it's the opening wound in a civilization's moral collapse. When Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, became emperor in 37 CE, Rome held its breath. At first, he was adored, a young ruler, descended from gods and heroes, raised among soldiers and senators. But that illusion shattered swiftly, and what emerged was not merely a tyrant, but a defiler of the sacred. Caligula turned his palace into a brothel, but this was no private sin. It was a public declaration. He ordered noble women to serve as prostitutes and forced senators' wives into degradation. It was not lust. It was ritual humiliation, the inversion of honor into spectacle. He didn't just crave pleasure, he demanded worship for it. Caligula declared himself a living god, Jupiter in flesh, and forced Rome to bend the knee. Statues of Roman deities were beheaded so his own face could be grafted onto divinity. He constructed temples for himself and required incense offerings as if he were holy. This wasn't divine madness, it was strategic blasphemy, because by making sin sacred, Caligula unshackled every taboo. His orgies were not whispers in shadow, they were policies of empire. In one infamous decree, he invited all Rome to witness his fornications. Dignitaries watched in silence as the emperor raped, tortured, and mocked under the guise of entertainment. He claimed authority not because he was moral, but because he was untouchable. This is where the story turns. For Caligula's reign didn't just corrupt the court, it numbed the people. When emperors parade depravity as divinity, the people forget what decency even means. Laws bent to his will, not to protect the weak, but to permit new forms of abuse. He once appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, as priest and nearly as consul. It was not a joke, it was a warning. Your institutions mean nothing. When Caligula laughed, Rome obeyed. When he wept, the senators feared for their lives. Some believe he went mad from illness, perhaps poisoned by fever. But here's the truly disturbing part. His madness was institutionalized. The Senate, the nobility, the army, they did nothing. They dined in the same halls where girls were defiled and boys were auctioned. Their silence wasn't ignorance, it was cowardice. For in Rome, to speak against a god was death, and Caligula made sure everyone knew he could kill with a whisper. He executed senators for dreaming of his death, dreams extracted by torture and spies. He had families slaughtered for not applauding loudly enough. The people laughed when he laughed and died when he frowned. But the moral infection ran deeper than fear. Children grew up with Caligula as the template of manhood. Theatres mimicked his rituals. Poets immortalized his excesses. The soul of Rome, its virtue, its discipline, its sense of shame, was slowly anesthetized. And when shame dies, evil becomes ordinary. Caligula did not merely commit sins, he made them fashionable. His incest with his sisters was whispered first, then joked about, then expected. He bragged of bedding them before their husbands did at royal banquets. These were not private scandals, they were performances of power. He was not hiding perversion, he was demanding participation. To reject him was treason, to mirror him was survival. And so, the court became a theatre of flesh, blood, and trembling obedience. But wait, it gets worse. Caligula's cruelty evolved into theology. He built temples to his sadism, ordering sacrifices not of animals, but of decency. He demanded mothers offer their sons, husbands offer their wives, as tribute to his divine hunger. Rome became a shrine to appetite, with Caligula as its high priest. He called it liberty. He meant bondage, and no one dared oppose him until the very end. In 41 CE, the Praetorian Guard, sickened and afraid, assassinated him in a corridor. His body was hacked to pieces, his godhood finally mortal. But what they could not kill was the culture he had transformed. Rome did not repent, it adapted. The next emperors would keep the robes, the rituals, the rot. Because Caligula had proven one thing beyond all doubt. If a ruler is wicked enough, long enough, the people will stop noticing the wickedness. They will call it eccentricity, then they will call it freedom, then they will call it truth, and finally they will call it theirs. Caligula died, but the infection of his reign, his divine perversity, became the air Rome breathed. From god to beast, he walked the ark in reverse and dragged an empire with him. And today, when our own rulers mock virtue and sanctify shame, we must ask, is Caligula really dead? Or has he simply gone digital? Imagine an emperor so feared that even whispers against him were considered treason. Imagine an island retreat so secluded, so fortified, that no one truly knew what went on inside. This is the story of Capri, not as paradise, but as a palace of silence. When Emperor Tiberius withdrew from public life around 26 CE, he left Rome in confusion. He claimed old age, political fatigue, and the need for rest. But what he really sought was a realm where no rules applied. On the cliffs of Capri, far from the Senate and the public eye, he built something more than a villa. He built a private world, insulated from accountability and scrutiny. Ancient accounts tell us this was no peaceful retirement, it was a transformation. Tiberius was no longer merely an emperor, he became something darker, more elusive. Villa Jovis, his main residence, loomed like a fortress above the sea. Servants, entertainers, and attendants were brought in, some very young, many very vulnerable. Roman historians describe an environment where the line between entertainment and exploitation blurred dangerously. Euphemisms were born here, words like minnows, to mask what was too disturbing to speak directly. These accounts, from Suetonius and Tacitus, are not mere gossip. They echo across centuries as warnings about power left unchecked. Tiberius did not simply isolate himself, he constructed a system of control based on fear and indulgence. Rumors of bizarre rituals and disturbing spectacles made their way back to Rome. But no one dared intervene. Why? Because to oppose the emperor was to risk everything. Senators knew. Generals suspected. The elite understood, and they said nothing. Silence became survival. Capri was not governed by law, but by the emperor's whims. Some who disobeyed, or merely displeased him, were said to vanish from its cliffs. Their fate became a legend, their silence a symbol. This is where the story deepens, not in scandal, but in cultural decay. Rome's most powerful men continued their rituals, their ceremonies, their flattery. Tiberius's name was still praised in temples. Decrees from the island carried the weight of the state. The machinery of government never paused, even as its soul eroded. Here's the unsettling truth. The emperor didn't need to hide, because the people in power decided not to see. They rationalized, they minimized. Some even imitated. The behavior once whispered about began to surface in other palaces. Historians noted how imperial standards reshaped societal norms. What was once viewed as unacceptable became, over time, a marker of status. The farther the emperor drifted from virtue, the more the court adapted. And when those closest to power mimic vice, the ripple effect touches the entire culture. The moral center of Rome shifted, quietly, gradually, dangerously. Tiberius had turned a remote island into a microcosm of imperial rot. But here's the truly disturbing part. When he died in 37 CE, the system didn't collapse. It adapted. The next rulers didn't start fresh, they inherited a precedent. The empire had learned that absolute power tolerates absolutely anything. That silence, when convenient, becomes policy. Today, Capri is a tourist site. Visitors take photos from the same cliffs once guarded by imperial decree. Few know the full story. Fewer still ask. There are no signs marking what really happened here. The past has been polished, but history remembers. And it forces us to ask a deeper question. What do we tolerate today because it is hidden? What truths are excused because of status, wealth, or fame? Tiberius didn't just retreat to an island. He created a model, one where secrecy and power walk hand in hand. And we see echoes of that model in modern headlines. Private estates, isolated retreats, institutions protecting the powerful, allegations dismissed, evidence buried, voices silenced. The names change, the methods evolve, but the pattern endures. The lesson of Capri isn't just about one man's moral decline. It's about a system that chose not to confront it, a culture that preferred comfort over courage, and a civilization that drifted quietly toward darkness while applauding its emperor. If we ignore that lesson, we risk repeating it. Because when those in power are never questioned, never held accountable, they don't stop themselves. They simply move to more remote islands. They build higher walls. And they rely on our silence. But history doesn't stay silent forever. It leaves records. It leaves warnings. And it asks us, what kind of empire do we live in now? Theatres were once built to honor the gods. Under Nero, they became stages for something else. Rome had seen madmen. It had seen tyrants. But Nero was something new, a performer with absolute power. Crowned emperor in 54 CE, he was just 16 years old. At first, his rule brought hope. He reduced taxes, promoted the arts, and spoke gently to the people. But the mask cracked quickly. Beneath the poetry and music was a man obsessed with control, not just over politics, but over how Rome felt, how it applauded, and how it obeyed. Nero didn't just rule through decree, he ruled through spectacle, and his spectacles redefined what society was willing to tolerate. He fancied himself a god of art, a savior of culture, a prophet of expression. But his performances weren't confined to stages. They spilled into law, policy, and daily life. One of Nero's most infamous acts was his public declaration of marriage to a man. But this was no simple statement of affection. It was an elaborate ceremony where he dressed as a bride, and the partner had been forcibly altered to match Nero's preferences. Roman historians describe it as theatre masking tragedy. The event wasn't about love, it was about redefining the boundaries of power. And the audience? Rome itself. Citizens were expected to cheer, not because they believed, but because silence was dangerous. Applause became survival. Dissent became treason. Nero's personal choices weren't confined to the palace. They were broadcast as virtue. He demanded participation, not just tolerance. Banquets, festivals, and public performances turned into showcases of indulgence. Acts that once belonged to the shadows now occupied the center stage. Senators were ordered to attend. Nobles forced to laugh, applaud, and join. Even the army was pulled into these rituals, swearing loyalty not just to an emperor, but to a lifestyle. This is where the story turns. Because Nero's decadence was not private failure, it was national instruction. When an emperor models excess, society rewrites its norms. Soon, playwrights mirrored his themes. Artists echoed his images. What was once whispered became fashion. And what was once considered sacred, family, honor, temperance, was now mocked openly. Nero didn't just perform perversion, he branded it as imperial progress. He declared that Roman values were outdated, that to resist indulgence was to resist Rome's future. And the elite followed. They competed in opulence, flaunted their own excess, and silenced any voice of restraint. The line between ruler and audience vanished. Nero turned governance into entertainment, and the empire cheered. Even his darkest decisions came wrapped in performance. The suspected assassination of his own mother was followed by public tributes and poetic lamentations. He mourned her on stage. After allegedly ordering her death, he burned down parts of Rome, then sang of the flames as if tragedy were beauty. And when citizens lost their homes, he blamed the Christians. Thousands were persecuted, not because they were guilty, but because they did not applaud. Here's the truly disturbing part. Nero's approval didn't immediately collapse. Many Romans continued to support him. Why? Because by then, the culture had changed. Standards had shifted. What once repulsed now fascinated. The people had grown used to the noise, the chaos, the blurred boundaries. And beneath it all, a generation was growing up believing this was normal. That truth was negotiable. That dignity was subjective. Nero had turned Rome into a mirror of himself. And when he finally lost power, facing rebellion and public disillusionment, he fled not as a general, but as a failed actor. His last words, according to legend, were not about justice or regret. They were, "What an artist dies in me." But his true performance didn't end with death. The culture he curated, the glamorization of excess, the elevation of self above all, endured. Later, emperors imitated him, artists praised him, and even today, he is sometimes defended as a misunderstood visionary. But the cost of his vision was a society unmoored from truth. Nero's Rome shows us what happens when performance replaces principle, when applause becomes a weapon, when rulers entertain rather than lead, when the people are taught to admire what once alarmed them. This wasn't mere decline, it was redefinition. Morality wasn't abandoned, it was inverted, and Nero's stage became the nation's reality. Today, we see echoes of his reign, in leaders who blur lines, in cultures that confuse fame with virtue, in performances that demand not just attention but allegiance, and in societies that reward the loudest, not the wisest. Nero may be gone, but his theatre still stands, in new arenas, on new screens. And the question remains, are we the audience or the actors now? What happens when the emperor no longer reflects the order of the empire, but its undoing? When authority doesn't just permit chaos, but celebrates it as sacred? Enter Elagabalus, Rome's emperor from 218 to 222 CE, a teenager with a crown and a mission to turn the world upside down. At just 14, Elagabalus was elevated to power, not for his governance, but for his bloodline, and perhaps his spectacle. He didn't just rule Rome, he sought to reinvent it in his image, and that image rejected every boundary that had once defined Roman life. Gender, ritual, custom, even religion, nothing remained untouched. Elagabalus brought with him a new deity from Syria, Elagabal, the sun god. This wasn't just spiritual reform, it was cultural disruption. Traditional Roman gods were pushed aside. He ordered that all temples, including Jupiter's, submit to his new cult. But here's the deeper shift. It wasn't just theology he redefined, it was identity itself. Elagabalus blurred the lines between man and woman in ways that shocked even Rome. He appeared in public wearing women's robes. He insisted on being called lady by palace attendants. And ancient sources claim he sought medical procedures to alter his body to match how he saw himself. This wasn't private exploration. It was a public, imperial doctrine. Marriage became performance. Elagabalus married 5 times, including to a high priestess and to a man. But these weren't statements of love. They were statements of power. He was redefining not only who the emperor could be, but what Rome itself meant. Ceremonies became carnivals. Sacred rites were transformed into staged parodies. The court was filled with dancers, mystics, and theatrical displays. What was once holy became confusing, then absurd, then forgotten. Elagabalus didn't merely erase tradition, he drowned it in noise. And for a brief moment, Rome watched with fascination. But here's where the story turns. Because while some cheered the novelty, others began to feel the foundations crack. Senators whispered about chaos in the court. Generals questioned the emperor's priorities. Citizens, once curious, grew uneasy. This wasn't tolerance, it was transformation by force. Elagabalus made no room for dissent. Rituals of the old faith were suppressed. Statues of former gods were desecrated. The emperor didn't just demand acceptance, he demanded submission to his vision, and the people had no choice but to play along. But power built on spectacle is fragile. And Elagabalus began to lose control of the very carnival he'd created. The palace descended into excess, banquets, pageants, and displays of theatrical self-worship. Public funds were drained, soldiers were neglected. Rome's infrastructure began to decay, not just morally, but materially. The empire's outer provinces stirred with unrest, but the emperor was too busy orchestrating performances to notice. What began as a revolution of identity became a failure of leadership, and when Rome's patience broke, it broke swiftly. In 222 CE, just 4 years into his reign, Elagabalus was overthrown in a military coup. The Praetorian Guard, once his protectors, turned on him. He was assassinated, along with his mother, and their bodies discarded in public. It was a violent end, but also a symbolic one. Rome was trying to purge not just a ruler, but an idea. The idea that identity was whatever power claimed it to be. That truth could be reshaped by decree. That society must bend not to principle, but to the emperor's preference. Yet even in death, Elagabalus left a mark. Because once a boundary is broken, rebuilding it is never easy. The chaos he introduced lingered, first in whispers, then in culture. Rome would never be quite the same. and modern historians still debate his legacy. Was he a misunderstood iconoclast? Or a symbol of how power can lose its compass when unmoored from tradition? Either way, his reign teaches us something crucial. That leadership without grounding becomes theatre. That celebration without restraint becomes confusion. And that a civilization too afraid to question spectacle may quietly accept its own undoing. Today, we see similar patterns. Institutions that once stood for order now promote ambiguity. Leaders who preach progress often abandon wisdom. And culture, like court, often becomes performance over principle. Elagabalus ruled for just 4 years. But his carnival outlived him, in symbols, in trends, in warnings. And the question is not whether we remember him, it's whether we're repeating him. Rome once believed that emperors should embody virtue. Then came Commodus, and that belief died in the arena. He didn't just break rules, he made a spectacle of breaking them. Ascending the throne in 180 CE, Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher king. But where his father sought wisdom, Commodus sought applause. Not from scholars, not from statesmen, but from the bloodthirsty crowd. He fancied himself a god of war, a living Hercules, destined to rule not by justice, but by performance. And performance became policy. Commodus appeared in public wearing lion skins and wielding wooden clubs. He declared himself the reincarnation of myth, then demanded Rome agree. He didn't merely attend the gladiator games, he entered the arena, as emperor, as combatant, as performer. Of course, his opponents were unarmed, often crippled, sometimes even staged actors. But the crowd was told to cheer anyway, because under Commodus, truth was irrelevant, only the illusion mattered. And here's where it gets darker. This wasn't just theatrical ego, it was a new imperial doctrine. Shame was abolished. Dignity was discarded, and the empire's moral compass was replaced by applause. Commodus indulged not only in combat, but in cruelty. Historians record a pattern of disturbing behavior, mock trials, twisted punishments, and public humiliations. He used power not to lead, but to dominate, and to amuse himself. Those who resisted were branded traitors. Those who complied were rewarded. The Senate became a stage, the law a prop, and all of Rome watched as the line between entertainment and governance collapsed. Statues were erected in his likeness, not of an emperor, but of a gladiator. Cities were renamed after him. The months of the year were given new names, each an extension of his ego. Rome was no longer a republic in memory or spirit. It had become a court of spectacle, presided over by a man without restraint. This is where the story turns, because the true horror wasn't just Commodus, it was the silence around him. Senators who once upheld Roman virtue now cheered his performances. Nobles who once prized discipline now mimicked his flamboyance. Morality faded, not because it was outlawed, but because it was mocked. And the people, starved of true leadership, accepted the show. Commodus promised them bread, games, and distraction, and in exchange, they surrendered their voice. Even his private life became theatre. Tales circulated of bizarre rituals, chaotic indulgences, and excesses cloaked in ritual. But nothing was secret, because Commodus didn't hide. He celebrated his impulses as symbols of divine right. And Rome, exhausted by politics and numbed by novelty, failed to resist. Public morality eroded, not through violence, but through entertainment. Decency became old-fashioned. Shame became weakness, and the once sacred became spectacle. But every performance ends. In 192 CE, conspirators from within the palace, fed up with chaos, plotted his assassination. A wrestler hired as his bath attendant strangled him in silence. No grand battle, no trial, just the quiet end of a noisy reign. And yet, Commodus left more than a corpse. He left a precedent. That rule could be a stage. That cruelty could be glamorized. That a society could lose its soul without even realizing it. The fall of Commodus didn't save Rome. It exposed it. That for years, the people had traded substance for spectacle. Applause had replaced accountability. And a generation had grown up thinking shame was an enemy of freedom. But here's the truly disturbing part. We see these patterns still. In cultures that celebrate the outrageous over the righteous. In leaders who pose rather than govern. In media that rewards attention over truth. Commodus may have died in the shadows, but his legacy lingers in the spotlight. And the question remains, when entertainment becomes our morality, who really rules? The emperor? The crowd? Or the silence in between? Rome forgot the cost of shame and paid for it with its soul. We would do well to remember. Power can build cities, fortresses, and temples. But when fueled by fear and obsession, it also builds prisons of the mind. King Herod the Great ruled Judea from 37 to 4 BCE and left behind more than just stone and legacy. He is remembered as a master builder, a political tactician, and a man entrusted by Rome to govern a volatile land. But behind the architecture was an unraveling soul, one whose private torments turned into public policy. Herod's paranoia was legendary, even in his own lifetime. He surrounded himself with informants and spies, desperate to know who whispered against him. His own family wasn't safe. He executed his wife Mariamne, accusing her of betrayal, though history questions the truth. According to some accounts, he preserved her body in secret, haunted by what he had done. Whether fact or legend, it speaks to a deeper truth. Herod's obsession was not political, it was personal. Love became possession. Jealousy became law. He also executed 3 of his own sons, fearing they might conspire against him. To be close to Herod was to walk a narrow ledge, cherished one moment, condemned the next. His rule became a case study in how insecurity distorts leadership. But here's where the story grows more disturbing. Herod was not seen as insane. He was celebrated by Rome, praised for his loyalty, admired for his grand projects. He expanded the Second Temple in Jerusalem, a feat of engineering and religious diplomacy. He constructed palaces, fortresses, and entire cities, stamping his name into the landscape. But for every stone he laid, trust eroded beneath it. His court was built not on stability, but on surveillance. The fear he carried within became the fear he inspired in others. According to ancient texts, he even sought control over the private lives of his subjects. Some accounts suggest he interfered in family arrangements, dictated marriages, and monitored household loyalty. These weren't mere cultural customs, they were acts of domination cloaked in authority. Herod didn't just want obedience, he wanted emotional ownership. And in a society bound by faith and tradition, this was an inversion of all order. The Bible speaks of Herod as the one who, fearing prophecy, ordered the massacre of innocents in Bethlehem. It's a horrifying portrait, not just of cruelty, but of fear dressed as governance. Herod feared a child, a prophecy, a future he could not control. And so, he turned power into preemption. But what he couldn't kill was truth, and truth became his greatest enemy. His later years were marked by isolation, illness, and unrest. Trusted aides turned against him. His health deteriorated, and his paranoia grew. Yet Rome continued to support him. Why? Because Herod delivered results. The empire valued order more than morality. Stability, no matter how fragile, was prized above justice. And this is where the story turns. Herod was not a rogue tyrant. He was a function of the system that empowered him, a ruler whose most destructive traits were tolerated, even rewarded. The court knew, the priests knew, the people knew, but fear bred silence, and silence enabled obsession to become authority. Herod's legacy is often sanitized, reduced to architecture and alliance, but the darker truth lingers in ancient records, that behind every monument was a man unraveling, and a society unwilling to speak. The danger wasn't just in Herod's actions, it was in the normalization of his behavior. When suspicion becomes leadership and possessiveness becomes policy, what remains of freedom? Herod ruled for decades, and when he died, chaos followed. A divided kingdom, a crisis of succession, a wound that echoed through generations. His name became a cautionary tale, yet even today, echoes of his rule remain. Leaders who confuse control with care, systems that reward loyalty over truth, cultures that privilege silence over courage. Herod's story is not just history, it's a mirror. It shows us what happens when fear sits on the throne, when obsession masks itself as strength, when authority is used not to protect, but to possess. The Bible remembers Herod not for his buildings, but for his cruelty, not for his wealth, but for his war against prophecy. And in doing so, it reminds us of something eternal. That truth, no matter how fragile, cannot be buried by power, and that the cost of unchecked rule is always paid by the innocent. Herod ruled Judea, but he never ruled peace, because no man obsessed with control ever finds rest. The corruption of a ruler rarely ends at the throne. When emperors lose their virtue, they do not suffer alone. The decay spreads, quietly, persistently, from palace to plaza, from law to lullaby. Roman society did not erupt into debauchery overnight. It was shaped, eroded, reimagined in the image of its emperors. Caligula's brothel palace wasn't just a personal vice, it was a signal. A signal that the unthinkable was now imperial policy. Nero's staged perversities were not hidden, they were applauded by command. When the emperor claps, the Senate must cheer or disappear. So Rome cheered, and over time, it learned to like what it once loathed. What began in scandal ended in fashion. The artist painted what the emperor performed. The poet sang what the court normalized. The lawyer codified what the palace demanded. Thus, elite vice filtered into every corner of Roman life. Art celebrated the grotesque under the guise of genius. Theatre turned sacred shame into farce. Laws were rewritten, not to protect virtue, but to reflect power's appetite. The distinction between ruler and ruled blurred. Between madness and culture, the line vanished. Roman families began naming children after tyrants once cursed. Statues of naked emperors adorned public fountains. Orgies were no longer secret. They were state-sponsored festivals. The vulgar became the vogue. Schools taught children the myths of Jupiter's lusts as moral parables. But who wrote the curriculum? And who dared question it? Morality became nostalgic, something spoken of in past tense. A relic, like an old temple turned theatre. Even religion bowed to the emperor's whims. Vestal virgins once vowed chastity to the gods. Now, they entertained gods of flesh. The temple became the stage. The sacred became a costume, and the people adapted, because what choice did they have? When your job depends on laughter, you learn to laugh. When your life depends on applause, you become the audience. Rome became an empire of spectators, watching vice as virtue, cruelty as comedy. But wait, it gets worse. These spectacles weren't mere diversions, they were doctrine. Each performance taught the crowd what was permissible. Each scandal taught the Senate what was profitable, and each silence taught the innocent what was inevitable. Slowly, the unthinkable stopped shocking. Citizens who once gasped in horror now sighed in boredom. A society can be trained like a beast, and Rome was being trained by its rulers' desires. From the palace balcony, corruption cascaded, not as a flood, but as a perfume. Sweet at first, then suffocating. Every family learned the new rules, even if no one said them aloud. What is tolerated by the throne becomes tradition to the people, and what the emperor whispers in private becomes the chorus of the streets. Even language changed. Words that once condemned now celebrated. Virtus became vanity. Pudor became performance. A new Rome was forming, not by invasion, but by imitation. And no one could stop it, because everyone was inside it. The people who once feared Caligula's madness now feared obscurity. To be seen, one had to outshock the last. To be safe, one had to laugh at the emperor's joke, no matter how cruel. A new generation was raised on the ashes of restraint. They had never seen a Rome of order, only of appetite. They couldn't imagine a law above lust, nor a god above Caesar, because Caesar was now God, and sin was now law. And in such a world, the people became mirrors of their masters. Broken, yes, but polished. They reflected exactly what Rome wanted to see. Not the truth, but the theatre. Not the sacred, but the spectacular. And in this spectacle, the empire decayed not from war, but from worship. Not of the divine, but of the depraved. This is where the story turns. Because once the people are converted, they don't just follow, they defend. The emperor no longer needs to command. The culture enforces itself. And that, more than any sword or senate, is how corruption conquers. Every empire has its rituals, but when vice becomes ritual, power becomes poison. Rome's descent was not spontaneous, it was administrated. Corruption moved from scandal to system. What Caligula began in madness, the Senate refined into method. Institutions that once stood for virtue now preserved vice. The Senate, once a check on imperial whim, became a chorus line. Nero performed, they applauded. Elagabalus desecrated, they chanted hymns. Commodus executed, they passed resolutions of praise. Not out of belief, but out of fear. Because in Rome, fear disguised itself as loyalty. To dissent was death. To remain silent was survival. And so silence became the rule of law. Roman generals, trained to fight for honor, now fought for favor. Priests who once guarded sacred texts now read from imperial scripts. Even poets knew a flattering verse could buy freedom. Truth was dangerous, so it was hidden, mocked, or rewritten. Archives erased what emperors disliked. Statues were rededicated, names chiseled away. Memory itself became political, and history became a servant of the present. Rome's legal codes, once rooted in justice, were twisted to protect the guilty. Laws were passed not to restrain lust, but to enshrine it. Offending the emperor's desire became treason. Protecting innocence became rebellion. When Elagabalus offered gold for surgical transformation, not a single priest protested. When Tiberius retired to exploit the vulnerable on Capri, the Senate sent gifts. These were not isolated sins, they were signatures of the age. And everyone signed, because corruption was now currency. Those who participated profited, those who resisted vanished, and those who watched learned to look away. This is the hidden genius of institutional rot. It teaches the people to call collapse stability. It builds schools that forget history. It builds theaters that replace truth with entertainment. It builds shrines to flesh while the soul decays. But wait, it gets worse. Rome's rot didn't stop at indulgence. It rebranded immorality as virtue. Public orgies were reframed as expressions of freedom. Violence became spectacle. Cruelty became art. Any voice that called for restraint was labeled regressive. Conservatism was mocked as superstition. Restraint was rewritten as weakness. The past was treated as bigotry. The future belonged to the liberated. Liberated from conscience, from covenant, from God. Rome once built temples to gods. Now it built monuments to emperors. Caligula's statue stood in the temple of Jupiter, not beside the god, but in place of him. This wasn't blasphemy. It was the blueprint, because when power wants worship, it must erase the divine, and Rome erased with elegance. 1,000 schools, 1,000 scripts, 1,000 celebrations, all proclaiming, this is normal, this is healthy, this is who we are now, and any who doubted were corrected or removed. Rome did not fall in fire. It fell in applause. Applause for emperors who paraded sin as splendor. Applause for institutions that silenced the righteous. Applause for the rot that promised joy and delivered ashes. And the people, numbed and hungry, clapped along, because when every street echoes the palace, even silence sounds like consent. And in Rome, silence was the loudest lie. Here's the truly disturbing part. These institutions didn't just fail to stop evil. They became evil's architects. They designed the Colosseums. They choreographed the executions. They edited the scrolls. They smiled as they did it, because they believed they were saving Rome. And perhaps they were, but only the Rome of their making, not the one worth saving. Rome was not the first empire to fall from within, and it would not be the last, because when elites corrupt, they follow a script, a timeless choreography of descent. First comes indulgence, private, hidden, excused. Then comes public performance, repackaged as culture. Then institutional protection, laws written to preserve sin. Then societal imitation, when the people mirror the palace. And finally, collapse, disguised as progress. This is not new. It is ancient. Babylon danced this dance. Persia flirted with it. Greece philosophized it. And Rome perfected it. Each believed their brilliance could outshine their moral blindness. Each thought sophistication excused perversion. Each forgot. What begins in the bedroom ends in the battlefield. And no army can defend a crumbling soul. The archives whisper the pattern. Scrolls of Babylon describe priests turned predators. Persian kings married sisters and called it divine right. Athenian elites exalted lust as liberty, while democracy rotted. In every case, the people followed. Not because they were evil, but because they were led. Leadership is not neutral, it is contagious. The palace sets the temperature, and the people adjust. So when emperors burned incense to flesh, the nation inhaled. When kings mocked marriage, the people mocked faithfulness. When rulers defiled sacred spaces, the people redefined the sacred. The masses didn't vote for decay. They adapted to it, and that adaptation sealed their fate. Because once evil becomes expected, it becomes defended. The child grows up thinking chaos is choice. The scholar praises the emperor's depravity as genius. The priest rewrites scripture to match Caesar's desires. The soldier forgets who he's fighting for. And soon, the empire forgets what it ever believed. But wait, it gets worse. Because the pattern isn't linear, it repeats. Again and again. And each repetition becomes harder to detect. The next empire learns from the last. Learns how to hide corruption in celebration, how to turn seduction into curriculum, how to build monuments to vice and call them progress. Rome didn't just fall, it taught others how to fall. And the lesson was this: control the culture and the conscience will follow. Change the music and the people will dance. Rewrite the myths and the child will believe. Exalt the flesh and the soul will shrink. Institutionalize sin and call it civilization. That is how patterns repeat, not by force, but by framing. The decline is disguised as liberation. The bondage is labeled as freedom, and anyone who sees through the illusion is branded the enemy. History remembers those who danced, but not those who warned. Jeremiah's tears echo through the ruins of Jerusalem. Daniel wept in Babylon. Paul preached restraint in decadent Corinth. And every voice that cried out was told, "Be quiet or be crushed," because the pattern has its guardians: academics who fear truth, priests who crave relevance, politicians who buy silence, and artists who sell beauty without virtue. Together, they become the chorus of decay, singing lullabies while empires die. This isn't just history, it's prophecy. Because we're watching the pattern repeat again. The architecture is digital now. The emperors have Instagram accounts. The theater is streamed. The corruption is global. But the truth remains unchanged. When the few embrace darkness, the many forget the light. Some names echo like ancient curses, not because they are forgotten, but because they are known and ignored. Jeffrey Epstein, a man who became the modern symbol of elite depravity. He didn't just exploit, he hosted the powerful while doing it. His island was not a secret, it was a shrine. A shrine to wealth, secrecy, and the flesh. Politicians flew there. Celebrities stayed there. Billionaires funded it. And for years, no one stopped it. Even after his crimes surfaced, the machine protected him. Judges sealed documents. Journalists buried leads. Prosecutors stalled. And finally, he died under mysterious circumstances. But he didn't act alone. He never could have. Because monsters like Epstein are only possible when the system feeds them. And this is where the pattern repeats. Donald J. Trump, found liable for sexual abuse and defamation, yet adored by millions. Celebrated, not despite scandal, but because of it. Bill Clinton, settled harassment claims, flew on Epstein's jet, played the saxophone while moral fire consumed the pillars. And the people laughed. Silvio Berlusconi, Italy's Bunga Bunga emperor, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, nearly ran the IMF, accused of predatory assault. Anthony Weiner, Larry Craig, Roman Polanski, R. Kelly, Ian Watkins, household names, or prison numbers. But here's the truly disturbing part. These men didn't hide their sins well. They simply had the right friends, the right lawyers, the right networks. When the people are outraged, the elite litigate. When the truth gets too loud, they flood the room with noise. They rebrand perversion as personality. They spin abuse into narrative. And when that fails, they vanish, briefly, only to reappear on book tours and podcast circuits. Because in this world, moral disqualification is temporary. But fame is forever. These men didn't fall, they floated. On wealth, on connections, on cultural fatigue. Because the public is exhausted. The outrage becomes entertainment. Confession becomes viral content. and justice becomes performance. Meanwhile, victims remain statistics, silenced not just by fear, but by spectacle. In ancient Rome, emperors wore masks for theatre. Today's elite wear sincerity, tearful apologies, redemption arcs scripted by PR firms. I've grown. I was struggling. That's not who I am. And the crowd, trained by culture, claps. Because we are taught to forgive celebrities faster than we forgive neighbors. But what if forgiveness isn't the issue? What if the system was never built to restore, but to recycle? Corruption, like fashion, has seasons, and each new scandal becomes old news before it's even judged. But that's not all. This is much worse than we imagine. These are only the names we know. The visible tip of a deeper rot. Because for every Epstein, there are 10 unnamed, hidden by NDAs, offshore accounts, and elite silence. The palace still stands, the island still whispers, and the emperors still rule. Once, sacred meant untouchable, holy, set apart, protected. But in the hands of corrupt elites, even the sacred becomes soil, especially the sacred. Because if you can desecrate the divine, you can control everything beneath it. This is where the story turns dark, not with emperors, but with priests. Not with outlaws, but with shepherds. Theodore McCarrick, a cardinal, a symbol of spiritual authority, and a predator. His abuse was known, yet buried by bishops, buried by institutions, buried beneath layers of vestments and bureaucracy. Lawrence C. Murphy abused hundreds of deaf children over decades. The church moved him, protected him, paid for silence. Ravi Zacharias, apologist, author, idol, behind the podium, a voice for God. Behind closed doors, a manipulator of women. He built a global ministry and a private empire of abuse. He used donations to fund massage parlors, used theology to silence dissent. His staff knew, the board knew, and still the machine kept moving until it couldn't. But by then, the damage was done, and the faithful were left with shattered trust. Because this is the deeper cost of elite corruption, not just broken laws, but broken faith. When the pulpit is defiled, the people wander. When the sacred is profaned, the soul recoils. But the rot didn't end with clergy. It spread to temples of fame. Jerry Sandusky, revered coach, convicted predator. He used football as his altar. R. Kelly, idolized by millions, used music as bait. Roman Polanski, award-winning director, still celebrated in elite circles despite fleeing justice. Ian Watkins, a pop star who concealed atrocities behind stage lights. The pattern is unmistakable. The closer a man stands to adoration, the easier it becomes to hide. The more sacred the role, the more blinding the charisma. Institutions should shield the innocent. Instead, they shielded the powerful. Churches issued apologies instead of warnings. Record labels signed contracts, not indictments. Universities hired lawyers, not truth-tellers. And society learned a terrible lesson. If you shine bright enough, you can sin in the shadows. But wait, it gets worse. These men were not anomalies. They were pioneers of a new religion, a religion of image over integrity, of applause over accountability, of charisma over character. They turned holiness into performance, devotion into disguise, and the people, longing for something pure, gave their hearts to wolves, because no one told them. Not every shepherd has a staff. Some carry knives. Not every choir sings truth. Some harmonize with hell, and not every pulpit points to God. Some point only to themselves. This is the profaning of the sacred, the inversion of what was meant to heal, a theatre of light built on secrets, a sermon of comfort concealing cruelty. And when exposed, the system asks, can we move on? But the soul cannot move on, not until the sacred is sacred again, and the profane is named. These are only the names we know. But what if the worst crimes are committed by those with the power to vanish records, silence witnesses, and rewrite law itself? What if modern empires don't wear togas or crowns, but own studios, courtrooms, and curriculum boards? The most disturbing truth is not what these elites did, but how little they suffered for it. For every Epstein exposed, how many more remain untouched, shielded by their wealth, alliances, and lawyers? This isn't accidental, it's structural. The system doesn't just overlook the crimes of the powerful, it is built to absorb them. When Roman senators cheered Nero's debauchery, they weren't just afraid, they were invested. Today, billionaires own the platforms where deviancy is glamorized and dissent is shadow-banned. Newsrooms delay stories. Judges seal records. Politicians stall investigations. And the people, desensitized by decades of slow erosion, scroll past headlines like they're fiction. But here's the truly disturbing part. This apathy is engineered. Media speaks in euphemisms: open marriage, sex positive, alternative lifestyles. Beneath these slogans lies a war on innocence, on virtue, on meaning itself. Hollywood packages perversion in prestige. Streaming platforms reward narratives that blur lines between adult and child, love and domination, identity and distortion. The gatekeepers are not asleep, they are architects. This isn't decay, it's design. Laws are softened not by accident, but by lobbying. Curriculums are rewritten by think tanks funded by billionaires. Morality is not debated, it's rebranded. In schools, children are taught to affirm before they understand. In courts, predators receive leniency under the guise of equity. In entertainment, vice is painted as victory. And the righteous are mocked as backward, bigoted, or paranoid. But ask yourself, why must virtue be mocked at all? Why must innocence be exposed so early, and boundaries redrawn so constantly? Because in a system built to protect corruption, clarity is the enemy. Everything must become grey, blurred, malleable, because in the fog, wolves move freely. Once upon a time, Rome's decadence shocked the world. Today, it trends on social media. The line between scandal and content has been erased. Victims are secondary to virality. Documentary exposure becomes entertainment, not outrage. The algorithm decides what you care about. And behind that algorithm? Someone who profits from your numbness. Elites used to hide their perversion behind walls. Now they flaunt it on red carpets, accompanied by applause. Accountability is only for the poor, the powerless, the unfavored. For the rich, there is image management, crisis PR, foundation donations, awards. Some even win peace prizes. This is where the story turns. Because if the worst crimes provoke no real consequences, then justice itself is a performance. And, like Nero's stage, the crowd is trained to cheer or be cancelled. But justice without truth is theatre, and theatre cannot stop tyranny. Behind every exposed predator lies 100 silent protectors, agents, donors, board members, bishops. The crimes are monstrous, but the system is the true abomination, and it thrives on your disbelief. The more absurd the revelation, the more likely it will be dismissed as conspiracy. The more powerful the figure, the more complex their legacy. Obfuscation is protection. Complexity becomes the enemy of clarity. But let's be clear. No child consents. No robe or rank sanctifies evil. No ideology justifies silence. These systems do not need reform. They need exposure, dismantling, judgment. And the judgment must begin not with outrage, but with repentance. Because what we tolerate, we teach. What we excuse, we empower. And what we ignore, we become. The palace is no longer physical. It's digital, viral, curated. The throne is no longer gold, but influence, platform, and immunity. And the subjects are no longer citizens, but consumers of curated rot. Yet even now, the system fears something. It fears those who still call sin by its name. It fears the clarity of scripture, the boldness of truth, and the voice of the child who says the emperor is naked. Because once the mask slips, the spectacle ends. And once the spectacle ends, judgment begins. That's why the system must protect itself, not just from justice, but from awakening. But now you've seen it. Not just the crimes, not just the names, but the fortress of silence, money, and ideology that keeps them safe. The system built to protect them is real, and it only survives if we refuse to look. From Caligula's palace brothel to Epstein's private island, history whispers the same warning. Civilizations do not collapse because of famine or war alone. They collapse when their rulers worship flesh over truth. When power loses shame, the people lose direction. Rome's decline wasn't marked by a single invasion, but by centuries of moral erosion. The emperors didn't just fall, they took their people with them. And not through force, but imitation. What began in whispers, indulgence, perversion, silence, became public policy. And once law aligns with vice, virtue becomes rebellion. In Nero's Rome, the righteous were burned as criminals. In today's world, they're cancelled as intolerant. But the spirit is the same. Evil doesn't always come with a sword. Sometimes it arrives in costume, branded as progress, streaming as entertainment. We are taught to laugh instead of mourn, to desire instead of discern. But the ancient pattern has not changed. Every empire that glorified its rulers' sins met the same fate. Oblivion. Babylon fell, Greece crumbled, Rome decayed from within. Not because of barbarian invasion, but because the elites became barbarians. And the people, craving comfort over clarity, followed. This is where we must confront ourselves. Because today, the emperor's stage is in our pocket. The brothel is streamed. The feast is posted. What once hid in shadow now demands applause in daylight. And too many cheer, forgetting what they've lost. Modesty is mocked. Innocence is rare. Families fracture, not from poverty, but from poisoned values. Mental illness surges, not for lack of medication, but for lack of meaning. The soul is sick, but no one is allowed to name the disease, because the truth is dangerous. It threatens empires built on appetite. It exposes industries sustained by sin. And it reminds the powerful that judgment is not a myth. The Bible says, "When the wicked rule, the people groan." But it also says, "Righteousness exalts a nation." We are not doomed yet. But redemption does not begin with policy. It begins with repentance. It begins with mothers who shield their children, not appease culture. With fathers who lead, not retreat. With churches that preach holiness, not trendiness. With truth spoken even when the stage hisses back. Because silence is not neutral. In the face of engineered collapse, silence is complicity. The emperors of old built statues to their lust. Our elites build algorithms. Both seek worship. Both promise freedom and deliver chains. But you were not made for chains. You were not made for numbness. You were made to discern, to protect, to stand. The battle is not merely political, it is spiritual. And the stakes are not just historical, they are eternal. So, ask yourself, who is modeling your values? Who shapes what your children cheer for? Who profits from your distraction, your division, your despair? These questions matter, because history is not a memory, it's a mirror. And what we see reflected now is not Rome's glory, but its ashes. Yet, even in the ruins, a remnant can rise. If we reject the empire of appetite, if we remember that corruption thrives on forgetfulness, and if we choose again, righteousness over relevance, courage over comfort, conviction over consensus, because when the rulers are wicked, the people rot. But when the people repent, the rulers fall. And when the truth returns, the soul of a nation can still be healed. But it begins with seeing, with naming, with mourning, and then with rising, not in protest signs or party lines, but in homes, pulpits, classrooms, and hearts. This is not about nostalgia. It's about survival. Because if we fail to break the pattern, we will become it. And future generations will read about our fall, wondering why no one dared to speak, while the palace burned and the people danced.